institutional video about the second census of the judicial power. Have you answered to the second census of the judicial power? We want to know the judges, the servers, the public servers, so we can know their profile, socioeconomic profile, and we want to understand from the census the level of satisfaction of the work environment and what are the impacts of this routine in their personal lives are, in their health and well-being. The CNJ will be able to develop public policies to uh, improve the services for you, and this survey is very short, so participate on it, please. The census occurs at each 10 years, and the answer is very important. I have already done mine. I have already done mine. I have already done mine. So we follow the programming for the international conference for the electronic monitoring, ethics, right guarantee, and technology. For those who are potentially, you need to sign up to in the record through the QR code. They are on the out of the auditorium, and you can see on the screen. By means of the link, you can also in the YouTube link, you can also show your presence. In the panel, talking about the um, household violence facing, we are going to talk with the mediator, the public defensor of the Amazonas state, and assessor of the monitoring department and fiscalizing in the jail system and execution, the measurement execution system, the Juliana Guiari, Linhares de Aguiar Lopes. And as a speaker, the judge from the Ceará state, Teresa Germana, and the member of the Superior National Council of Belgium, Pedro Ferreira Maru. For the conduction of these works, we have the Doutora Juliana Linhar Lopes. Good morning, everyone. First of all, we start with by means of, for the purpose of accessibility terms, I describe myself. I'm a white woman. I have black hair, and I'm wearing a jacksuit, a pink jacksuit, and I am in the center of this table. For those who can't hear me and want to know where I am, and so we can start this panel, this important panel, in which we discuss the electronic monitoring as a way to face the household violence. Uh, I welcome the panelists, the international panelist, Sir Pedro Ferreira Maru, and the judge, Brazilian judge, Doutora Teresa Fernanda. It's an honor to count on you on in this event. To face the household violence is a challenge for all those who work in the Justice Department. In the surveys we have done through the Datafolha Institute, we see that all the violence types they have grown against women. We had over 1,800 million of women suffering with violence, and at each three women over 16 years old, they have been already uh, victims of physical aggression, sexual aggressions by their partners or their mates, which is a higher index of 27% in the international rate. As the feminicide, we have in the record 1,200,000 cases in 2022 compared to the last year. And these studies they have demonstrated the biggest challenge for the initiatives to reduce the violence against women. In Brazil, the Maria da Penha law started a mark in the fight against the household violence, and we are trying to consolidate a policy against this cultural phenomenon with a big complexity. The Maria da Penha law creates mechanisms to stop household violence against women and proposes the constitution of educational programs and administrative measures that can determine some measures to stop the aggressor. These measures that are forcing against men in their violence against women, they have to go through a bigger control looking for the safety of women, just as the electronic monitoring and even the prison always going through the principle of the penal individualization. The electronic monitoring has to take care of the woman in an individual way, and the equipment that is used by the author of the violence should help to localize the geolocalization through the information system. So we create exclusion areas that the aggressor cannot go in during the monitoring process. Even though we have this, we cannot solve all the conflicts in the relationship areas because this is a penal equipment, so it's not implying effectively the resolution of the conflicts that are in the root of the situation in this violence. So we are talking about restrictive measures towards this person that's being monitored. So it can sometimes motivate other types of violence, and some imposed conditions can um, be a prov- can provoke the vulnerabilities and to have difficulties with the health treatment and other problems. The studies they demonstrate that the growth of these devices in Brazil does not mean the reduction of the violence against women. These are some topics that we want to go deeper in this panel. In this board, we have specialists that can cooperate in our understanding about the challenges that are existing today, as well as the uh, electronic monitoring in cases of household violence, just as the steps to qualify this institute. After these initial considerations, I pass the floor to the Dr. Pedro Ferreira Maru, who I present, introduce formally. Pedro Ferreira Maru, he's certified in AI in equipment, and he works in the public sector for 30 years in the penal execution and alternative measures of prison in the Belgian system. He has formulated the ethics system for the European Council. He is the member of the Supreme Justice Council and the designation of the judges for this system. And he's a previous director of the surveillance, the Belgian department until 2022. He was the president of the uh, judges that were surveilling the electronic surveillance in the Confederation European Probation, and you have 35 minutes. Good morning, everyone. So I need to introduce myself. Physically, I have to say that I am 100, 1 meter and 80 centimeters, and I'm chubby. So just as you can see, I'm speaking Portuguese. My natural language is French. I work more in English, but I will make the effort to speak in Portuguese today. There are some differences between the Portuguese of Portugal and Brazil. I had to visit here sometimes, and I will I will not aventar money from the ATM, but I will sacar dinheiro from the ATM. That's how we say in Portuguese here. So there was a time that I was asking for sparkling water, and the the waiter he just said, "Okay, beleza," and he went away. Beleza is a way to say cool in Portuguese. It's a, these are some words that we learn when we come to Brazil. It's a great honor to be here today to discuss a very relevant topic, the household violence and uh, facing and the electronic monitoring as an extension of the penal control and social security. Today in Brazil, we have many women that are suffering in silence. They are victims of physical and psychological aggressions. The fight against this evil is fundamental for our society because no woman should live with fear in his house. The household violence degrades our humanity. It breaks with the social tissue and impedes the progress. And the way that we can measure this nation is how we can take care of the weakest members. We need some politics that can be efficient, education, solidarity to face this terrible reality. From 2006, the ley Maria da Penha has been a uh, values to face this evil, increasing the penalties for the aggressors and establishing mechanisms of protection for the women. But the fight should continue. In the last 10 years, we saw the surging in the technological companies' opinion a way to use the technology, GPS technology, in the battle against the household battle. So they are being monitored by the GPS. The first thing I thought at that time was like when you have double GPS is double payment because when you have only one GPS, we had it had already some problems. I couldn't see why Belgium should pay twice to have twice more problems. And beyond that, we saw that we should start an analysis of a problem to have a solution for this domestic uh, violence as a solution with the GPS. And I knew that the electronic monitoring goes beyond than a sample acquisition of a GPS material. And I always thought that it was an absurd to call the electronic monitoring to be called electronic. The aggressor, the public ministry, judge, how do you say that in here? Okay, yeah, that's how they say. The judge, the police, the lawyer, the probation agent, the social assistant, the the police of the penal execution, the family, the friends, all the social tissue, the boss, the professors, the monitoring manager, agents, the management, and I forget some other profiles. These are at least 15 human on one side, and on the other hand, we have one box and one monitor. How is it possible that so many people to give life to this monitoring and so few technology, we can't call it electronic monitoring. It should be called community integrated community monitoring or MIC and period. It would be more representative of the reality. The reality that the technological company they have done and they are lobbying the near to the decisions, the ones who take decisions with a simple message. They say, okay, oh, look at what my box can do. It's everything automatic and safe and cheap. The companies they got to reiterate the product, and we know that is a lie. I will not. I will talk about that later. But even though I believe that we need to expand the use of the community integrated monitoring system in an ethic way in all the country, and the violence against women is a stain in our society that we cannot forget. And together we need to build Brazil that's safe, egalitarian for all the women. I don't want you to think that this is a arrogant European message that that's how we should do. I know that you're already doing a lot of effort and doing good things. Brazil is. This is a image that I took from that when I when I went to the National Museum from a Latin artist, and it's very symbolic in the work that you are doing in Brazil. And I've heard in these past days some very interesting things regarding the respect, the human dignity, and human rights. So that's just to share some of my experience. It's not to impose over you what should be done. It's just my experience. Nonetheless, as it was said, it's important to highlight that the electronic monitoring is not only to furnish technology. Technology is a means; it never should be a goal. Just as I said, just as Dr. Isabella said yesterday, the question that we should have is not what technology could do for us, and the companies they know how to do that and to expose that, but what could technology should do for us, and this is more complicated. It's not only about the device. We should know what we want and not, and if it is this and other things. And it's integrated through politics, technical, psychologic, sociologic, judicial, financial, and ethics throughout the term that we should create. And we need to create this uh, community integrated monitoring should uh, not be different from the others, because in this the victim protection is the first goal. It's not the punition aspect towards the aggressor. That's not the main goal. This type of politics of monitoring is positive and not negative. uh, on the conceptual level, this type of monitoring or that the community has or should have is to save time. Technology should help us to save time, to help the reconstruction of the victim, to help her conditions to go into a resiliency process. It's a concept that Boris Kurlik likes a lot. It's a long process that should be accompanied by professionals and familiars and relatives. And this process of resiliency is reinforced by the fact that the aggressor is in the community, but not actually not in a deal, but of course with guarantees that he should be away from the victim. And the resiliency process with the aggressor in prison is more complicated for the victim because she has it's got the Damocles sword that constitutes the exit of the aggressor from the prison. With him outside of the prison but monitor the process can be accompanied by the resiliency and has more chance possibilities of success. But for the aggressor, this type of monitoring does not limit to the control, but also provides time for him to go into his desistance process, and is also accompanied by the professionals and should be accompanied by the professionals. So add to that the fact that participating in uh, the jail population, and you can understand why I am favorable to this principle in a community integrated monitoring in a positive way that should not be negative. And from the chances of we should give opportunities to the resiliency, resistance, and to lower the level of the jail population. My father, my grandfathers, they were in the politic prison during the Salazar dictatorship in Portugal. We had some dictatorships over there in our history, and my parents they escaped to Belgium, and I was born in Brussels as a expat refugee of the United Nations. I had this status until I was 6 years, moment of the Kravos Revolution in April 25th, 1974. So that's why, with great emotion, I'm here in front of you with the United Nations program for the development to present it to you. From this founder myth, it constituted the condition of my birth, and up until today, I have the will to limit the use of the jails for those who need the most. I'm not abolitionist, and the prison is a evil and necessary evil, and sometimes it's necessary, but it should be the last medicine because attacking the fundamental right from women and men, which is the individual right, uh, should be used with a lot of care and with all the rigor that the human rights they deserve. With this will in their heart and in their head, in their mind, I first graduated in criminology and I started first in the experience and then after in the federal justice to work with the development of the penalties and measures alternative to prison, in particular to works of general interest. And I finished without even taking that into consideration, depurating the area of the penalties and measures alternative to prison. And in 2007, I was asked to work in the direction. And when I was a young person, I had difficulties to be aware of the numbers, but I will talk about that later. And I had the honor to work in the European projects of the probation and electronic monitoring, and to work in Europe to help countries to develop better their judicial system, in particular with the electronic monitoring and probation. It is a level that is asked for the country to integrate in Europe. Other than that, I was integrated in 2013, 2014, the group of the European Council that I just described, to in doing the recommendations to the states members of Europe in that is respected to the electronic monitoring. And finally, from 2020, I am the member of the Superior Justice Council, which is the equivalent to the CNJ in Brazil, the co-organizer of this event. I even the organizer, and I greet you because of this. We are a constitutional body. We have the Belgium Justice Superior Council has a lot of recruitings and promotions for all the uh, magistrate areas, and its experience very rich in participating in this jury of nomination designation. And there I am specializing in the ethical questions and the moral dilemmas that the candidates should resolve during the recruiting audition. I'm also specialized on the assessment of the management plans to the of the candidates who are in the direction of the district tribunal. So sorry about just speaking about me. You can understand a little bit about my intervention from that. The recommendation of the 2014/4 to European members of the states. We can read that on the internet, and I will. And it was already mentioned by some of my colleagues, and will be mentioned even more by my colleague Anthea in some minutes. And we will only point out some elements that are more pertinent for the electronic monitoring in the household environment. And it's important to understand that the European Council, the electronic monitoring, including the one that should be used for the domestic violence, should only be limited to be a way of surveillance used to monitor the localization, the movement, and the specific behavior of people in the criminal justice process, and nothing more than that. Everything that's all the people that is there, the team, that's the complete monitoring for me. The use, the types, the duration, the execution modalities of the electronic monitoring for the household violence should be regulated by law. That's what they are trying to do in Brazil. We already have some laws, we have some recommendations, but we are still on the go. And for the translators, I will go to the page 11. In Brazil, I see that to have the it's common to see the absence of the safety protocols, just as the share of data. In many cases, it looks like the information they are shared and monitored by people that are in different institutions. This challenge is being faced by many countries, especially those related to the in cases related to violence against women, considering on one hand the need of agility for the women's safety, and on the other hand the importance of not marginalize these two and to guarantee the information sharing only and absolutely necessary information in emergency cases. The data protection is a crucial aspect of the monitoring, and especially when we are dealing about the household violence. But the safety of the victims and also of the aggressor should be kept in safety in all the moments. And in Belgium, these data they are legal property of the monitoring service. We only share when we have a request from a judge or the court, and these data they are shared, not indirectly. when we directly only share with the police, the jail system, and the probation department, but only the rules violation of the aggressor, and only after a when a official for the service in the management department can evaluate, he assesses the situation. We also share the situation, the status of the person during the monitoring. The status is like he's being monitored and he's not violating the rules. He's I've seen that here in Brazil have the same thing when the police sees a person with the anklet. Before they would call and say, well, is it normal this person to be outside or not? Yes or not? Yeah, it's normal to the police to ask these questions, but we create electronic system that allows the police not to call, but they can only look at the status. And if the status that he's not violating the rules, there is not a problem. So we don't waste time with that. The other status is that he's monitored, but he's violating the rules. The other one is he's monitored, but he's not technically monitored because he took away the anklet. He doesn't respect the schedule or the limited space. It doesn't respond to the monitoring system appeals or doesn't obey to the instructions of remediation that are given to him. And we need to distinguish these type of situations. And at last, the last state is the fugitive, the prisoners that escaped. He lost the status of being monitored, and he is now and we don't have any competence, and we are only depending on arresting him. So we need to look for him. We cannot do anything else. But to be complete, I need to say that the provincial departments also has the zones, the schedules that are authorized, that are forbidden to the monitored person, and the agent of probation is the one that determines the schedule. And regarding the law, respecting the law and the judicial decision that were previously set up, and he's the one that normally makes the schedule, the probation agent. So the electronic monitoring as a means to face the household violence is a tool that can be used in an adequate and proportional way that can also bring meaningful benefits for the social safety and for the victim. But it's fundamental that we need to be careful because to guarantee the conformity with the law, different measures should be implemented, and we should look for the consensus and cooperation of the victim and of the aggressor. We cannot impose these systems if both of them they are not in agreement. Actually, they are the ones who should ask for this system. The modalities of execution and the level of intrusion in the electronic monitoring should be proportional to the crime and also based on the risk assessed by the person, if the person can flee, and to intervene in the progress of the justice, and should represent a serious threat to the victim. And it's essential to obtain the previous consent of the victim to make all the efforts to guarantee that the victim should understand the ability and limitations of the technology. And this monitoring, and with this monitoring, since this electronic monitoring is related to the exclusion limitation of the specific zones, efforts should be done to guarantee that these conditions of execution should not be restrictive up until the point they can impede the a quality of life that is reasonable for the community. And I think that the resolution 412 talks about this recommendation. But the age, deficiency, and other specific conditions that are relevant or personal circumstances of each aggressor should be taken into consideration when deciding what modalities of execution and electronic monitoring should be imposed. And that guarantees that the electronic monitoring should be used in a fair and equitative way. With no circumstances, we can use the electronic monitoring to cause physical damages or intentional mental damages to the aggressor, and it's fundamental to guarantee that the electronic monitoring should be used in the ethical and human way. And the public servers responsible for the implementation of the electronic monitoring should be in sufficient number, inadequate, and they should be trained to develop their functions in an efficient way, in a professional way, and according to the ethical and high patterns. And their training should um, train them in data protection, and this training, which is a topic that my colleague Professor Ian Dornescu is a crucial component to guarantee that the electronic monitoring should be implemented in efficient and ethical. This includes guaranteeing that they are aware of the data protection terms and they are able to cope with these information in a safe and responsible way. And beyond that, we should have a governmental inspection, a regular governmental inspection, uh, to the independent monitoring by the responsible agencies for the execution of the election in a way that is according to the federal law. And this helps to guarantee that there is a adequate surveillance in the process, and if there is any problem, they should be identified and promptly resolved. And when we take into consideration the basic principles that I have already mentioned, and I mentioned again briefly the execution conditions, the ethical conditions, the data protection, and the role of the people, we should guarantee that the electronic monitoring should be used in an efficient and responsible way. No, tranquilo. I have I have gone through the document of CNG, the model of electronic monitoring management. It's a very well built document, and but it's also exhaustive. But it can certainly serve as a reference. You have the luck to have this document because in Europe, very few countries they have done this job. So I will talk about an economic model of the electronic monitoring that I learned throughout the years to be a mental tool and of communication. That's very important because comes from the needs of the customers and of the stakeholders. There are seven vital questions. I had several requests from behalf of the different ministers, and sometimes these requests were also requested by the companies of sales of the electronic monitoring, and they wanted to assess a new politic for the electronic monitoring, and some specific cases for the household violence. And I should say that I gave a negative assessment to each one of these requests because not because the electronic monitoring is not available, because the technology exists. The GPS, one for the offender and another for the victim. And for the victim, we see that sometimes it's just better to have that in the cell phone. But the technology exists, but the technique is quite trustworthy and doesn't produce many uh, problems with the alarm if the contract is well built with the market in the market that we normally do, and the prices should not be way too low. And when we do contracts with these companies, we should have the help of technicians, engineers to understand what we want. And the type of this market is a service type of market. We should ask for a service and not a product, because just as it was said yesterday by Jordan and other people, when the material doesn't work well, and doesn't work well in the beginning of the program. Everybody loses, the aggressors, the victims, all the public servers, everybody, they waste time, the ethics just go away with the material that has problems, and these are problems that we should fix. And yesterday you had the example that Dr. Isabel mentioned, and people normally they try to find solutions with the spoon that they put on the anklet, but it's pity that you don't know that other countries they have this problem in the beginning. In other countries they are trying to solve the same problems. It depends on the day that uh, we are and we find some problems, some solutions. If the contract is well paid, they normally find the solutions. And it's not normal that they are to tell me what the problems and we not so that we have already solved 3 years ago. And why are you having the same problem with other countries? It's not like why the company goes to another country and they have the same problems with other country. It's like almost if they were willing to do the problems for them. It's almost if they want us to have a lot of work to make the system to work well, so we do not we always give the contract to the same company, so we should not go on this trap, fall in this trap. It's normal to start from zero again. They have over 20 years of experience. They should offer a product of quality, but we should also pay a good price for them. It's of a good composition. I had 7 questions. I tried to summarize. The first question is I wanted to know, and I am this page 17, what is the problem that this electronic monitoring is trying to solve? Is it sensible to solve? What is the problem that you are trying to solve with that? Who are the customers? Who is requesting the service? What is the true service that you are offering? It looks like a simple question, but in reality it's not. And several times we don't have a clear answer. Because only to have a solution is not sufficient. Money is short. We can look at other different possibilities. Why are you talking about technology? And the answer to this simple question should clarify the economic model that is imagined, and I will describe for you. And in Belgium, when I started to direct this federal service of the electronic monitoring was sensible to solve the problem of the non-execution of penalties to prisons less than 3 years, because we had the jails they were full of people. So there was a minister that said that if it is a penalty of less than 3 years of he shouldn't go to jail. But if the person accepts, we could put it a electronic monitoring surveillance on this person. So this is the real request that we had at that moment. The idea was not to put people on electronic monitoring, but the real request was to not to load the level of population in the jail. With that, and this first question, I already knew, but the economic model that the electronic monitoring should be proposed should also have the sufficient weight on the mental scale of the judges to counterbalance the weight of the prison penalties and execution of these penalties, also in the judge's intention. It was not enough that the law could authorize, but it should have trustworthiness in the minds of the servers and also in the population, because they knew that people they wouldn't go to prison. They would say that okay, they will have a okay, they have a electronic monitoring, but it's not enough. And the journalists were also they needed to communicate. We had also the parliament and the ministers. We needed to put them on the same page, and not forgetting that we needed to provide credibility, trustworthiness to our partners in the electronic monitoring, because these partners were the police, the probation service. In Europe, they don't like much the electronic monitoring because they like to work directly with with the people and prisons. And these, the probation services, I said that normally this person, they say normally that this person should go to jail, but with our system, what we do is to provide time and opportunity to work with this person so we can, because we only work with people outside of jail, and that's the service that I offer you, and I provide you the possibility to work with these people. And this is the search of the win-win. It's important to, when we make business. So I will only talk about the other questions, and if Brazil invite me one time or I can talk a little more, I expect to have more of the another opportunity to talk about these aspects. So the second question is, on page 19, after what the problem that you want to solve is, uh, are there will politics to make the help program for the victims? Also the same thing for the aggressor. Do you also think about that, or do you think only for the aggressor? Third, do you have the guarantee that only the low and medium risk profile in the conjugal profiles are selected? Do you think that they are the only ones to be selected? Because here and that in the national experiences, the profiles with higher risk in this program, they should be avoided, because when one person wants to aggress with or without monitoring, she gets to do it. Fourth, we need to guarantee that the monitoring should not be imposed, but yes, it should be decided by a formal requirement from the offender and the victim. Do you think that you do that? Fifth, we establish protocols, legal status, and with the police, in cooperation with the police and the magistrates? Sixth, are there strong political wills and sufficient means to recruit and form the public servers in the public service to implement the electronic monitoring and to manage them? Normally, people normally they don't hear, those who don't hear the fifth question. I understand it's gonna be more complicated than I thought when the judge doesn't hear the fifth question. The seventh is how we can cope with data. We know that you guys have a new legislation, but it's already foreseen. So the answer for these seven fundamental questions, uh, the new politics of the electronic monitoring was a success. In one of the politics that was asked for us, in 10 years we were a country with very few electronic monitoring, and in 10 years we became a country with the um, lower number of electronic monitoring in all Europe. I still need to calculate, uh, comparing to Brazil, if the rate of the penetration rate is the same, and who can win in this journey for this small scheme. framework that comes from right to left. I will come back to talk about that in another opportunity. It's an important moment, just as I said. The question is, what is the problem you are trying to solve? How? What is the problem you are the service you are requesting? The skills you should have, the tools and strategic resources we should have, the cost. Does it cost much or less? The companies with the price, because sometimes this is 20% of uh, electronic monitoring program, and it costs a lot, but it's 25% of the cost of a day on jail. Good. I know that my time is gone. I When we calculate the number of words in Portuguese, it's much slower when we read that, but we only uh, make the last 10 considerations very quickly. The conclusions. First of all, we should prioritize the economic model for the integrated community monitoring, and this model should be fit in a justice model. And the business model that I mentioned very quickly, the monitoring should go into the business model of justice as a strategic resource. This electronic surveillance should offer the components of the bigger problem that is justice. It's not should not be directly with surveillance, electronic surveillance. As I said, it has a cost. It's necessary to have a service independently that can guarantee the quality of the materials, the negotiations. Dr. Isabel mentioned about that yesterday. The market should be of a service and not of a product. And according to this model, we should respect the ethics and data protection, and the cost of the should be from the beginning, other than the devices cost, should be taken in consideration. And the domestic violence is complex, that goes through that affects the races, different socioeconomical levels. And fifth, we the victim and the aggressor should require for the monitoring. The sixth, the electronic monitoring could be a tool to face the domestic violence, but the usefulness is limited and conditional. And the limitation, they normally come out from the nature of the domestic violence, the character of the aggressor, the risk, the technology, and other limitation. Eighth, the efficient evaluation of the individual aggressor that represents for the well-being of the victim is more important. Is more important to have this evaluation, risk assessment. And nine, the problems that accompany the monitoring and correspond to the risks and the needs of criminology, the individual criminology of the offender are fundamental for the recidivism. And last of these points, which is the more important, the safety and the well-being of the victim should be always in the center of any decision taken in relationship with the implementation and monitoring, electronic monitoring. And this program should be seen and conceived as to be fundamentally positive and not punitive. Thank you very much. It was quick. And just it says here, beleza. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Pedro. Thank you very much by your contributions. They are very relevant, and it's very important to think of a role of the electronic monitoring as a way to gain, save time for the victim to have a reconstruction, and it's also necessary to have other programs, just as you said, political will to have programs destined for the victim and aggressor to deal with this problem of domestic violence that is very much complex, and only the electronic monitoring without any work with the victim and with the aggressor will not have any effect, and we will only have high numbers of domestic violence. So thank you very much by this speech. We brought up some questions and questionings to point out how Brazil we can advance on this topic. Next exposal, I invite Dr. Teresa Germana. Before identifying yourself, I would like to thank you because you suffered an accident and you could maintain your speech here. It's very thankful for us to hear you. Thank you very much for maintaining your commitment with us. Dr. Teresa Germana has a master's degree in civil right, French civil right in the Université Panthéon-Assas in Paris too, in France. She is a uh, law judge specialized against women violence in Fortaleza. She is formalized by the magistratal school in Ceará. She is the member of the CIVID and the directress of Senavid and the directorate of Conavid in the northeast region of Brazil. You have 35 minutes for your exposure. Thank you very much, Doctors Juliana, to guarantee the accessibility of all those who are present here. I will describe myself here. I am a white woman with 51 years old. I have short hair, brown hair, uh, brown eyes, hazel eyes, and I have a flower dress, and I am on the right side of the table. I would like to greet all those who are present here and those who are also watching us and that will watch us in the future. They will have this possibility of reviewing what they didn't watch in the CNJ channel on YouTube. And I'd like also to greet in a special way Dr. Juliana Linhar Lopes and all the institutions participating in this event, in a special way the National uh, Justice Council in the person of the Judge Fred, and also our beloved doctors Isabela Pimenta and Zuleika, and the Pen Penucci, and all the people who are participating in this event. I'd like also to greet in a special way Dr. Pedro Barron. I congratulate you by your exposure and for answering the questions. That was very interesting, she said in French. And I would like to thank you because this is the third year that I participate in the CNJ and the other institutions, the partner institutions. They are always updating this event, this topic that was a strengthening. It started us with self-studies of self-custody, and we had the opportunity in the previous years in 2022, 2021 to participate as panelists, and I am very honored to and happy to be here in the third year. It's an event that has a bigger dimension with international dimension, and this is its presentation now and with partnership with other institutions. Um, Starting with this topic that was proposed to me, I also have some questions that I would like to propose and answer.
I'd also like to congratulate the institutions for always remembering to approach domestic and household violence against women. I've been a magistrate for 25 years, and since 2017, I've been acting specifically and exclusively on processes of home or domestic violence and against women. And I know it's important that in these studies about incarceration, and that in today's conference we're speaking specifically about electronic monitoring, right, Dr. Juliana? It's fundamental that we have this specific glance in this strand towards electronic monitoring. Everybody can hear me well, right? So it is fundamental that we have this look also regarding the electronic monitoring in those cases of accusation of domestic violence against women. I'd just like to ask for the click. And I've brought a presentation in which I want to approach and always remember that I always bring this. This is the third year, but I always like to bring this reflection that the electronic monitoring or the application of electronic monitoring in those cases of domestic violence against women is totally differentiated. It has a series of peculiarities. And not only the magistrates, but all of the operators of the law that will act in concrete cases should have this awareness of these peculiarities. So in these 2 days, or in this 1 day and a half, all of the participants have had the opportunity to follow themes of extreme relevance in regards to electronic monitoring, such as the new technologies, the selectiveness, the ratio and penal selectiveness, the practical dysfunctions of house arrest, the gaps in the monitoring under the light of international experiences. And today, we come to this theme, which is extremely specific, which is electronic monitoring in the combat against house violence or domestic violence. The question is this an extension of the penal control or social security? When I bring an issue or an approach that is absolutely practical, it's from my daily experience. Only so you can have an idea, today we have in the in the area where I work with about 7,000 cases, we have 69 people who are monitored. So it's a very small number considering the total of the cases. But why? Because it is important that we have a concern with these people. And I would like to call your attention to the first point that should be taken into account. Differently from what happens in the common monitoring, these people who are being monitored, these people who are being monitored in the processes that involve domestic and household violence, Dr. Pedro, they're also being deprived. Pay attention. They're also being deprived. They suffer restrictions in one of these three situations, either within the family home, as in the family path, as described here in the third article of the Maria da Penha law. So within the domestic facilities, in the family, or in any affection relationship. So if it is serious that you have a monitoring, an electronic monitoring, in the case of other kinds of crimes, such as theft and other kinds of crimes that probably have been dealt with here in the previous talks, in the case of domestic violence, this application is even more strict for three reasons, the main three reasons. The first one, as I've said, the person who is monitored will suffer restrictions, including of accessibility to the place where the person resided, to their family. Of course, I will talk about this issue too because it doesn't include the children in most of the cases, because the restriction will be in regards to the spouse or former spouse, but also in regards, in the case of affection, to a person. So you see the difference, right? One thing is the electronic monitoring in which the person is going to be in an exclusion area. Another thing is when the exclusion area is the place where the person used to reside. It used to be the home where the person could be living, unless the relation has been extinguished. For example, just a practical example. The couple is separated. They were no longer living in the same residence. So, but then the person is being accused of committing violence against their ex partner. So the place from where, I mean, their exclusion zone, if the person was no longer living in that place, will will not provoke such a big impact. But if the person was still living and the person is sent away from their home, you can see how electronic monitoring will have an impact, a much greater impact to the person's life, right? So this is why it's important that this application of the electronic monitoring be very well assessed by the magistrates that will make that decision. I'm not here defending that monitoring should not be used. Much to the contrary. If there is a need, I believe it should be applied. However, it is important that this aspect be taken into account. The aspect that these restrictions that I have said, I mean, that are not so simple ones. As for the children, it's very common that there is anger uh, from the part of the people who are being monitored because they think they are being stopped from seeing the children. But there is no such a stop, there is no such a thing or restriction unless there is a request, and the law says that there should be a study that should be carried out by the multidisciplinary team. You cannot, from the get-go, determine the children to be that the children be taken away and to suspend this the right to visitation without a study. But in regards to the victim, the judge can, and there is no need in the first moment of listening to the prosecutor's office. eh, Why? Because this is a matter of risk. So the judge, they have 48 hours when, as soon as they receive the request of protective measures in an urgency regime, they should meet that request, grant that request in 24 hours or less. So it's a matter of organization. The judges that have this kind of situation, they should have a time in their work journey so they can dedicate their time to exclusively to the appreciation of these measures, these requests of protective measures, and the judge has to consider that these hours should be fundamental sometimes for the survival of a victim. This is why we need this special attention. And as I said, there are three issues that make the efficacy of monitoring render the efficacy of monitoring pretty difficult. The first one, I wouldn't say in all cases, but we need to know that this exclusion zone or these restrictions will affect in a much deeper fashion the intimacy of the person who's being monitored because of the location. It could also be, I mean, it's fundamental that in the control hearing that the magistrate checks whether or not, in case it's granted, the freedom with monitoring, that the magistrate analyzes where this person could live. Because if the person is sent away from their home, they will not be able to return to the place where they were living before. So it is very fundamental to check the feasibility, the possibility of monitoring. Also, it is fundamental that there is the consensus of the victim. For that, the victim needs to be, uh, I mean, that when the person is arrested, the police officer should pay attention to make sure that they take note that there is a request of protective measures. So as I said, the first challenge is the restriction in a much more intense fashion in the life of the person who's monitored. The second one is that there is the Article 24A of the law Maria da Penha. There is the provision that the non-fulfillment of the measures such as electronic monitoring, the non-fulfilling of this decision means crime, autonomous crime, as provided in the law. So the non-fulfillment for a long time was an administrative irregularity, but today it is a crime. So that makes it that monitoring be something that could generate even more serious consequences if there is no compliance. For example, if they break the anklet or a person who doesn't recharge the anklet, I don't know if the most modern ones also need, but the ones that I work with, they have to recharge. So if the person breaks or fails to recharge, that could also be a new penal action for non-compliance of the protective law measures. And this makes it that this application generates a further accountability on the person who is being monitored. It is also fundamental in this sense, and I'm going to bring the solution. Now I'm bringing the cases first, the challenges, but I will bring two solutions to these challenges. So hang in there. So this is why I'm leaving this part to the end, the best for last. Now, a third challenge is that in the cases related to law 11,033, it is not possible the application of no penalizing norms, the ones that are in the law 999 of 95. So it is not possible, at least in my understanding, and there is also an article that rules over this impediment, for instance, offer of food or conditional suspension of the process. Nothing is possible in those processes related to the Maria da Penha law. Now, we are coming to the conclusion that electronic monitoring is applied. It cannot, or it should not, the person cannot do any sort of penal transaction or conditional suspension of the process. Once it is applied, it must be complied with. There will be restrictions that are very serious to the life of the person who's being monitored. And in case there is a non-compliance, person could be arrested for violation of Article 24A of the law of 2006. So you, ladies and gentlemen, can see how important it is to analyze the issue of electronic monitoring in those cases of domestic violence, because we have all of these peculiarities that should be observed by the magistrate, especially the magistrates that act or that apply this electronic monitoring in those hearings that are carried out during the time that the judge is available, because it will not always be magistrate that work on domestic violence against women. Sometimes it could be from other criminal instances that do not have actions related to this subject. Therefore, that's why it's so important that we have this constant debate on the subject, so that this special attention is ensured. So these are the three challenges that I bring to you here, the three challenges for the application of electronic monitoring. It's a lot more complex, the application, in my understanding, especially because it's difficult for the person all of a sudden to change the routine and come out of the place where they live. But at the same time, we're in front of a protective system that is brought by the Maria da Penha law, already discussed and based on international treaties as insurances against the violations of human rights, because the domestic violence against women was considered as a violation of human rights. So this is a kind of ponderation of value. On one hand, at the same time, when you are able to foresee the possibility of respect to the principle of dignity of the human person in all of the system that brings this special attention of ensuring the principle of dignity of the person to those who are submitted to electronic monitoring. On the other hand, we see a very strong system of protection to the victims of domestic violence. And this system, or these norms, they're all a legal framework that also is complemented with the norms emitted by the CNJ. So more and more it's been evolving. We've recently we've had new laws that have brought even more assurance to these guarantees to these law. The protective measures today, they have the possibility of application that is much broader because it is necessary that the judge sees that there is no risk of violence so that they can deny a protective measure. So there was any strengthening of this institute. So you see how this also renders difficult, not renders difficult, but ensures, makes the judge ponder on the value because the protective system has been strengthening more and more. So in this sense, it is basic that the operators of the law in general make a constant update, be updated consistently. As a matter of fact, important data is that we have more than 400 projects that are now being discussed against projects against violence against women. Projects that deal with the violence against women are being dealt with in the congresses or in the houses, the lower house and the Senate. This is why it is important to have these studies. I brought some norms only to show you as an example that the Maria da Penha law used to deal or used to bring innovations in the context of an educational program, such as, for example, the articles that I present, and that we can also see the protective measures of urgency. I will read them quickly because my objective is to come to the solutions to these challenges. So the suspension of the possession of a gun, a person can be taken away from the place where they live. They can be determined not to get any close to the person who is offended, the woman who is offended. Restriction of visitation to the children. These are some of the protective measures. Provision of food, attendance to education and re-education programs, and psychosocial therapy with specialists or in support groups. I would like to mention these two first cases as the solution. I have brought the three challenges, but what are the two solutions that I find now to overcome, at least in a reasonable fashion, these two challenges? The first solution that I see is this one brought by these norms, which are the programs, the recovery and re-education programs. And I also see the psychosocial support. Speaking more clearly, it is not just about electronic monitoring itself. Electronic monitoring is necessary, but we also need, through the creation and of support groups. So, electronic monitoring, given its seriousness and the level of restriction in the life of the individual, it is necessary that this restriction be followed by or accompanied by this institute that we can recognize through the creation and maintenance of reflexive groups. These reflexive groups, they have been more always common. They're not present in all of the Brazilian municipalities, but they are a solution so that the period of the electronic monitoring decreases. And why? Because this period of the electronic monitoring should be reassessed by the judge, and with the application together, I mean, when the person goes to the support groups, what is going to happen is that it is very likely, or at least it is expected, depending on the quality of the group or the people who, or the facilitators or the people who are involved, it is very likely that the risk will decrease a lot more intensely than if the person had not joined these support groups. As for the next solution, and I will detail them all, I'm just explaining now that it's possible to have other provisionary measures. I bring the articles that you probably know, just there is no reason to go deep into it. I want to come to the end, which is where I give you the solutions.
Next solution that I bring here is more adequate. It's actually to be considered the first one because it comes before the beginning of the group, the inclusion of the person monitored in the reflexive groups, which is the application of the assessment form. Before we apply the protective measure, it's fundamental that the magistrate and they can read before the national form so they can individualize each situation and verify if the monitoring is the best measure. The form was created initially as a conjunct measure. It was created by a conjunct resolution from CNJ with the National Council of the Public Ministry, and it was recognized by law. And it's fundamental today that, that in all the capitals they are benefited by this assessment application in this form. The victim answers for several questions, and this when they fill this form, it can be done by the disciplinary team, by the judicial team. It depends on each municipality or state. And based on this form, before they the judge he takes the decision, they should read the answers so they can analyze the level of risk and danger that they can see in the situation, and to understand if it is it is necessary to have a preventive harassment or the electronic monitoring. It's possible to have the preventive arrest because it's for some cases and because sometimes the electronic monitoring can work well, but for that it's necessary that we should analyze previously the assessment form and the forward of this document to the reflexive groups. And so one measure is precedent to this decision and the other one is comes after. And why should these measures be important? Because it's important so we can have this individualization, and we cannot forget to mention that the magistrates that act with the uh, household violence, they have a role that is more incisive in the the people that are jurisdictionate, and they cannot deal these cases as processes, lawsuits. These are families, these are lives, and some many times it's these couples they reconciliate. I don't have data to prove that, but this happens a lot. So it's important and it's necessary to look with a sensitive sight to that situation from the magistrate perspective, because sometimes there is a family that's destructuring and the violence is prevailing, and he can have a decision in this specific case, but just especially because they have these familiar affective bonds, this situation is very unstable, and from one moment to the other, they can have some alterations. So these magistrates should be attentive, should be aware to reassess at every 3 months this situation. So it is necessary to exist. There should be a constant training for those who are involved in this process. I will not read everything here. I will just say the topic, say out loud. I will not follow this slide. So it is necessary to have a constant capacitation of all the people involved in the uh, network that is facing the domestic violence. So we need to have these people that are applying these forms that they should be capacitated for that. And one of the biggest challenge we have that was also brought up as a question is uh, the challenge that we have today is to bring this capacitation for all the municipalities because not all the municipalities they have the police stations, so the police is not capacitated to work with that. So these delegates they should be enabled to apply this assessment form. It's also fundamental to have a bigger integration with the network, a constant articulation, for example, from the Justice Secretariat that could apply these assessments and also with the judiciary so that they can know in the, for example, if they need um, a report or in the case that they broke the anklet, they should be communicated and even more important, they should have access to justice. It is fundamental that the victims, the relatives, people monitored, and the person itself, himself that is monitored, it's important that they should have access to justice in the way that they can communicate all and any occurrence. It has happened that people they could reconcile and the person just turn off the device and he doesn't communicate the judicial. So it is fundamental that we explain well how the device works and the rules are. At the moment that we apply the decision, this decision should be written with clarity, explained with clarity by the teams, multidisciplinary teams. They should clarify each detail. Also, the public defenders and lawyers, they should cooperate in a way that they can take these orientations, these guidelines to the monitored people so that they can actually accomplish all the determinations. These needs are the need of capacitation of the involved people, the need of a bigger integration, articulation, so that people that integrate in the network, they could be always in touch. It is not possible to have a network without this articulation. Should have the magistrate, the police station, the policeman. Everybody should dialogue. Also, there is need of access and accompaniment in an individual way. This accompaniment should be done individually. The ideal is that the judge should have a spreadsheet in which he sees everybody that's monitored, so he can after reassess the situations and with that he can gain with agility uh, to assess the people that are monitored because this agility normally occurs in the process of putting people in jail and arresting people, but also should happen in the monitoration of these people. The idea is that we should have a tag, a different color tag for these people that are being monitored. If it is not possible to have that, the ideal is that each magistrate should have the spreadsheet in which he can accompany the person that should not have a excess of terms in the application or that this application should not be applied in an unnecessary way. So if you verify that there is not a risk, this can be revoked. And I don't want to say that it is not necessary. It is, but we should clarify through the groups. It is necessary to have these groups for women, and once you have more diffusion of these informations for men and for women, certainly the efficiency of monitoring will be bigger. So I just have 2 minutes left, and for this reason, I would like to thank all of you. Say that I am available for the next year event, and remember about these peculiarities, and to congratulate you by this individual side towards this uh, challenge we have. And it is fundamental to have the role of the state coordinations of the departments against the violence towards women to have this accompaniment, this help to the magistrate, the creation of multidisciplinary teams, capacitations, all this structure that the magistrates can have access to this information, updatings, and thank thank you once more and wish you a great follow up on this event. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Teresa, by sharing your rich experience. It's very important to see the individualization in each case, and especially the explanation of the magistrate and from people that are involved towards to the aggression about what it is, the what are these guidelines about, because sometimes we see them not accomplishing these guidelines because they don't understand them. They sometimes they their documents are still uh, in the court. So this multidisciplinary team with a clear explanation is very important, so we can explain the assessment risk form to avoid this problem with the electronic monitoring. This pro- this topic is very important and can bring out some questions, but because of time, I would like to thank Dr. Pedro, Dr. Teresa, but we need to close this panel, and I give the floor back to the ceremonial. We thank you by the speeches, and we'll follow up on the programming.
Deixar ligado e eu controlo aqui. Não precisa mexer, tá bom?
It's okay. You can.
Yeah, but then people
Mas o volume. Tá. Já tá no
if
canal
I talk.
Yeah, but he's going to monitor.
Ela vai
Oh,
falar,
okay.
Diga
vai
pra
falar,
ela
né?
que eu vou ajustando à medida que ela for falar.
As you are talking, he is going to adjust.
Tá aí, ó.
Yes, and we will. I'll check before
Ela quer
when I
checar
start.
antes de começar.
O slide?
É the slide or the mic?
O slide e a voz?
The
The
voice
voice. Uh-huh.
to check it's okay. If it's not okay, then you can tell me.
One moment.
Ok.
Okay?
Just a second.
This program developed a series of publications in the field of electronic monitoring. Their manuals, guides, and informs or reports that gather the most common knowledge regarding the practical protection observed in the program championed by Brazil. The applications or the publications are available via this QR code as well as in the booklet that you can find in the entrance of this auditorium. Furthermore, an effort of internationalization and diffusion of the technical knowledge without border, this Doing Justice program is launching during this conference. The principal products on electronic monitoring in English and Spanish. They are models for electronic management of people, material for public security, electronic monitoring of people, as well as informative brochure for the justice system, informative brochure for the social protection, as well as informative for public security. We also have this material available in English and Spanish of Resolution 412 of the National Council of Justice, which is the normative framework for the monitoring, for the follow-up of the monitoring of people law. You can follow the product via the QR code on the screen as well as on the material that is printed. To continue the conference on ethic and future perspective of electronic monitoring, we invite to the table as mediator the Minister of the Higher Court, Sebastião Reis Jr., and as speakers, Counselor of the National Council of Public Prosecutor's Office, Jaime de Cali Miranda, the Director of Citizenship of Alternative Penalties, Ms. Maiese Silva Parisi, and the Professor of Criminal Justice from Birmingham, United States, Arithia Hucklesby. To conduce this session, we give the floor to Minister Sebastião Reis Jr. Good morning, everyone. I would like to initially greet my colleagues here on the table and also greet the National Council of Justice for the initiative of organizing this event. The National Council on Electronic Monitoring, I believe it's a very up-to-date theme, in other words, that has a great a great coverage, and this exchange of information is very important, not only within our sectors of exchange, but also these international experiences in this exchange that will only serve to improve this our work. This final conference has a theme which is ethics and future perspective in electronic monitoring. It's very delicate because it tackles the issue of privacy. We need to ponder the limits in which it could happen, the circumstances and access of information. In other words, a bunch of details that may seem irrelevant, especially for those who are not involved in the process. In other words, for those who are not submitted to the process. But it's a matter that has to be thought with a lot of care and attention. And I would now hand the floor to our speaker, Professor Anthea Hucklesby. I'm sorry for the pronunciation of your name. Hucklesby, right? She's a professor of criminal justice in the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. She's an expert in electronic monitoring. She has contributed to many research projects and publications. Her contribution, the most recent contribution is tracking people, an interdisciplinary action that was financed by the British Council that will be published in August. Professor is also an academic researcher specialized in electronic monitoring in the Ministry of Justice of the United Kingdom and member of the Academy of Social Science. You have 40 minutes, ma'am. The floor is yours.
Okay, so this is going to be a bit different because I'm afraid I'm a wanderer. Okay, I don't really stay in the same place for very long, so they've given me a clip mic, so that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so hopefully that's okay for everybody, and as long as the translators can hear what I'm saying, then that's going to work well. So just to start off with, before I actually get on to my presentation, I just want to say thank you for the invitation, and especially to Isabella and her team who've got us all here safely. Hopefully we'll get us all home tomorrow safely as well. Her and her team are a fabulous group of women that if they continue as they've started, will do tremendous things in electronic monitoring and other parts of the penal system. So thank you very much for that. Yesterday's event finished with a question about, if you were in Alice's world, what would you like? And I'm going to hopefully give my contribution to that today. But before doing so, I wanted to say what I'm going to take away from this conference. And it's one thing. Well, not just one thing, but one thing that I'm going to hopefully do something about, which is the equipment. So normally I don't like talking about technology. It's not the important thing about electronic monitoring. But what's happened here is it's opened my eyes to a real significant problem. And that is about the way that the funding model operates for the equipment and the power of the technology companies, which I did already know, and I know a lot of them and have known them for a lot of years. But what we really need is a set of international standards for the use of this equipment. We have very stringent rules in the UK and testing of that equipment, and that's what really needs to happen here and in other developing countries using electronic monitoring. So what I'm going to do, there's two things on my list now, because one is the regulation of the same equipment used in dementia care. This one is to work with organisations including the UN Crime and Drugs, the UNDP and ICPA, and potentially the Confederation of European Probation, to get an international agreement about the kind of technology that can be used. I think that's my kind of takeaway from this conference. So that's what I am going to do, or at least try to do. So just before I start, I am from the UK. I've spent most of my time in Europe. While I've looked at electronic monitoring and been and seen it in lots of different jurisdictions, most of those have been in the Western world, Canada, Australia, Europe, the UK. So everything I've got to say is in that context. So you need to bear that in mind. The other thing that I learned several years ago is that actually the UK has what I would call electronic monitoring light, right? So while we have problems with electronic monitoring, they are not as significant as other places. And we use it in quite a light touch, very heavily regulated way, okay? And that's important for what I'm going to say, because I haven't changed my presentation from what I came with. I could have changed it. I could have done all sorts of other things, but I haven't. So let's begin. So we've talked a lot about electronic monitoring. Electronic monitoring is not one thing. It's a whole collection of technologies. Pre-trial, sentences, post-release in the UK and in many other jurisdictions as well. It's used in very different ways with different intensities. And I've written with colleagues about the different intensities of electronic monitoring in Europe. But it's important. America is very heavy, for want of a better word, and in Brazil, it's very heavy with the 24-hour curfews, etc., if I've got it right, okay? Also, the scale matters. So it's very different. We heard from Liam about having like 4,000 people on electronic monitoring. England and Wales currently have about 17,300. And we go to Brazil with 91. And I suspect you might be the highest in the world, but I don't know for certain. So that's important. EM is also a very intensive measure. It affects every aspect of wearers' lives, and I'm going to come back to that. And all that means we have a huge diversity of wearers. Okay? It's used around the world in different cultures, with different histories, And we've heard a lot about that over the last couple of days. And it's expanding in numbers, cohorts, and modalities. Every time you look round, it's being used for something else. And I know we've heard from the US that this isn't the case, and I think this is why the light, heavy intensity bit of electronic monitoring is so important. In Europe and in the UK, most wearers are relatively positive about electronic monitoring, but what they are comparing it with is prison. Okay, so if you asked a different question, do you prefer it to not having it at all, then you probably get a different answer. Okay, but if you ask them generally, how do you think about electronic monitoring, they'll tell you some problems. Okay, but generally they say it's okay. And there are some actually positive things that come out of it that I've written about elsewhere. But even when people think it's preferable to prison, we need to think about the motivations for using it, the consequences of its use, and we need to keep it under constant review and scrutiny. Right? We can't just let it stay there, because it has negative consequences, and we've heard a myriad of ways in which that is the case here over the last 2 days. But what we have got in the UK and in most of Europe, not all of it, is a very diversity-blind approach, what I would call a very diversity-blind approach to electronic monitoring. It's used in very standard ways. Everybody gets the same thing. Right? Here in Brazil, it appears to be 24/7 house arrest, and tell me if I'm wrong. In the UK, it's like curfews for 12 hours a day, from 7 in the evening till 7 in the morning. Okay, now you see the difference between those two things, which is why I say England and Wales has light electronic monitoring. Okay, the equipment, which we've heard quite a lot about, is basically designed by a group of techie men for Western markets. Remember that electronic monitoring started in the US and the UK and then spread across the Western world, and then has only kind of more recently come into other jurisdictions. I said there were problems. There are problems. Regularly reported with its size. We've heard a bit about that. The charging regime, we've heard about that. There's a problem with batteries, and the discomfort of the equipment. We've heard about that. Now, the way that the tagging companies deal with this is just to use the same tags for everybody with different strap sizes. So I would need a small strap, and somebody, let's take Pedro, since he would need a larger one than me. Okay. And that's the only way that physical differences are. And if you think about children, where we use it on kids in the UK, then it's substantially bigger on them. Women obviously have a different physiology, and I've talked about that somewhere else. Now, we've started to use what are called non-fitted devices. They're basically like key fobs, etc. So, and we haven't really heard that much about that here. So that might be something we could explore at another time. So that's now available, currently only by one provider, I think. Also, the regimes, the bits that go around the technology, were also designed and implemented in Western democracies for criminal justice systems dominated by men, right? Decision makers, offenders, defendants. The 11% of women that you have in Brazil is mirrored in many places. So it's about 10, 11% in the UK as well, and in most places. Okay, so it's very dominated by men. There's also been a problem, and we're kind of doing that here, which worries me a bit, with policy transfer, particularly in Europe, but it's happened all over the world. governments, international organisations, including the UN, and the private technology companies have perpetuated that original approach because they go to people who are, they get invited to go to countries which are going to implement electronic monitoring and tell them all about how it should be done. And then that mirrors some of the issues that happen. So that's can be good, but it can be problematic. I've lost a bit of my slide at the bottom. But there are perceived advantages to this kind of standardized approach. It's less expensive, not necessarily cheaper, not necessarily less expensive, but we've had already questioned that. It's less complex. It's a whole lot easier to have everybody on the same regime and the same equipment than to have different equipment, different regimes for different people. It's also, and I've got to remember what I've got on the bottom of my slide now, operationally easier for people who've got to fit the equipment, work out the system, because they know what they're doing. It's all the same. You can just tell somebody, you need to do it this way. There's also a veneer of equality with this, okay? And this is the bit that we're going to focus on in this presentation. Everybody gets the same. So that's okay, isn't it? That's fair. Yeah? Well, hopefully by the time I've stopped talking, you'll think otherwise. So, let's think about the cohorts. Now, we have talked a lot about that in the last couple of days. There is a general lack of published data in the global north, and I'm pleasantly surprised by how much data you've got on electronic monitoring in Brazil. I think that's better than many of the countries in Europe can produce. And I'm not going to say much about this because we've kind of done all this, but in England and Wales, the purpose and function of different modalities of use of electronic monitoring, so pre-trial, sentence, post-release, you'll see that our pre-trial population is nearly half of our electronic monitoring. Now, the number of sentences, the proportion in sentences is going down, and the portion of post-release is going up. I'm not going to explain why that is the case. We use currently three types of equipment, RF, and if I had more time, I'd be extolling the virtues of using RF technology over GPS technology. I think Brazil, like in common with lots of other places, have made a grave mistake by not using RF technology. GPS is just over a quarter, and we also do remote alcohol monitoring, which I'm happy to talk to anybody about outside of here. It also differs in terms of legal categories, in terms of protected characteristics, and again, we've got about 10% female. Ethnic minorities are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, as we've heard. And there's anecdotal evidence, but it's only anecdotal evidence that this might be the case for electronic monitoring as well. Particularly because we have a couple of schemes that will particularly target some groups. So we have an acquisitive crime pilot, which is basically persistent burglars and robbers, using electronic monitoring quite intensively with them, and also using electronic monitoring to keep gang members apart, and what we call county lines, which is to safeguard children who've got caught up in drug-related supply. Okay, so they are particularly will skew what we're doing. But no data exists on actually very important things when we're thinking about electronic monitoring, like caring responsibilities, work commitments, because we don't call those protected characteristics. Okay, so those things are very important to take into consideration. So just thinking about males and race, gender and race, and ethnicity isn't enough in terms of electronic monitoring, because it takes over everybody's whole life. So all the other things matter as much. So what does the research evidence tell us? We've heard a lot about this. Limited research on specific characteristics in my jurisdiction and actually over the world. But what we do know is that they experience electronic monitoring differently and it has a differential impact on their lives. Women with caring responsibilities, different clothing, particularly, I don't know whether this is the case here, I suspect it's more in Europe, that they can't wear skirts, they can't wear long boots in the cold weather, etc. But also, men who work on building sites can't wear their work boots. So it kind of goes both ways. Financial hardship, stigma, which I'll come back to, and we've heard a lot about that in the last couple of days. Young people, some work I did with Esther Parkanini, which was comparison of Hungary and the Netherlands and England. We looked at children and young people, and it affected their education and socialisation and some of their key life chances. Religious and cultural observance, whatever that may be, both inside and outside of the home. So an example would be in the UK that they come to your home to fit the equipment in the time that in Ramadan when you're supposed to be having iftar, or walk across your pet prayer mat, which has happened at least once, I know. Foreign nationals subject to electronic monitoring for immigration offences. There's a bit of research on this, unsuitable accommodation, mental health, exclusion and isolation, trauma, which I'll come back to, wearing the equipment, and the interactions between contractors, etc. But certainly in the West, there's no research on the intersections between those different factors. But we also have to recognise that there's differences within as well as between groups. So it's not just, all women think this and all men think that. It's more complicated. And we need to think about those other considerations: caring responsibilities, work and working patterns, mental health, trauma, etc. So we've heard a lot about pain. We've heard a lot about stigma. I think we need to just unpack some of those things a bit more. So there's a very rich tradition of scholarship on the pains of first prison, and then the pains of community sentences, the pains of electronic monitoring. I can go on. Different forms of punishment. But this term is really overused and has recently been argued, which I think I agree with, that it's reduced the impact. It's just used as a kind of throwaway this is painful. This is another pain to add to the list of pains, which is getting longer and longer and longer and longer. And there's no way, we're not differentiating between those different pains sufficiently or prioritising the ones that matter. And in particular, we are not differentiating between the intended consequences of punishment and the unintended consequences. And I think this is important because however much we might not like it personally, the reason why you are using electronic monitoring, pre-trial slightly different, is because somebody has done something wrong and the courts think that they need to be punished. Okay, we might not like that, but if we're going to actually get people out of prison, we need to distinguish between those ideas. So, why is it important? It's important to demonstrate that electronic monitoring and actually community sanctions and measures more generally is effective at meeting their aims and objectives. And however much we don't like it, some of those aims and objectives are punishment related. Now, How you talk about punishment is a different thing, right? And we probably have different ways of thinking about it. But that's what victims often want, that's what the public often want, and that's what the courts, the purpose of what the courts are there to do. So if we want them to use community sanctions and measures rather than prison, we have to show the ways in which electronic monitoring and other things fit the purposes of punishment. So it's about meeting the expectations of those decision makers about what they actually want. It also helps to counter the claims of leniency that we hear all of the time, right? That community sanctions, electronic monitoring, it's all too lenient. That's why we don't use it, right? And we have to think carefully about why people think that. It also will promote the legitimacy of electronic monitoring, i.e. that they're not just sat at home being able to do what they want, watch the telly all day. It's easy, isn't it? Right, that was ironic, by the way, just in case you don't realise that, right? But that's how people think about it. That isn't it so easy, perhaps not quite so much after the COVID lockdowns, but still people think it's easy. They could just stay at home. So it promotes the legitimacy if we can just think about these two things differently and hopefully promote appropriate use. So what are the pains, i.e. the intended consequences of electronic monitoring? Or indeed whatever the tool is being used for. So the goals of punishment are met by depriving wearers of liberty and autonomy, which in the pains literature is seen as a pain. Yeah? One of the pains outlined originally was that you use your liberty and autonomy. That's what prison does. Okay, so electronic monitoring confines people indoors at a specified place if it's curfew monitoring or if it's 24-hour house arrest. It bans them, can ban them from certain areas or keep them in an area by exclusion or inclusion zones. It can ban the consumption of alcohol if you use alcohol monitoring. It can ban them from a physical proximity with named individuals, so you can't go either for the victim or co-accused. And it can monitor their movements. Yeah? So that's what it does. It stops them doing some stuff that the system thinks they shouldn't be doing. The pre-trial goals are obviously different. They're about preventing specified behaviours like absconding, interfering with witnesses and offending. But similarly, there would be, and I could do the same thing for that, okay? And then we have kind of heard a bit about this, but it's not been put in this sense. So people have a typology of activities, yeah? And there's three basic kind of things that we do. One is those basic needs, which we have heard a lot about. Okay, they're eating, they're shopping, they're going to the doctors, they're going to the hospital, taking your kids to school, all of those things that we all do. Then you have your work and your education, which we've heard quite a lot about as well. Okay, and then you have leisure, which are all the nice things that you do, but you don't actually need to do them. Okay? So certainly in the UK, electronic monitoring was originally set up, and many community sanctions and measures are set up, so that you lose your leisure time. Okay? You stop being able to do the nice things you want to do. You can't go to that football match. You can't go to the pub in the evening, or the bar, sorry. Pub probably doesn't translate very well. Or to the cinema, or, you know, all of those things that you'd like to basically go out. Yeah? But it doesn't impact or shouldn't impact, and I've heard in Brazil that it does, so that's a bit problematic. That's why I think this is useful. On your basic things, you should be able to go and do your shopping, your doctors, your dentists, your kids, all of that. And you should be able to do your work, your education, your occupational things. But perhaps you should be targeting that leisure. That's the deprivation that we need to try and think about. So, if we move on to harms, and honestly, I could have had a list of about 40 by the time I sat here for two days, but these are the ones I did before I came, okay? So, preventing wearers from exercising important rights, religious activities and events. So you can't go to church on a Sunday, you can't go to prayer, all of those kind of things that might happen. Preventing wearers from caring for others. So you can't go down the road to see your mum to cook your dinner, or you can't travel, okay? Because in the UK, not everybody lives very close to their family, so you can't travel for the weekend or for the day to see parents. Deterioration of physical or mental health. You can't go out and exercise. Yeah. You can't sit in the garden, which incidentally is a thing in the UK too, and a problem. Increased tensions and prevalence of violence in the home. We also know that in some cases it repairs fractured relationships in the home as well. Like compromising the privacy of your wearers or the significant others they live to, but also restricting the activities of those significant others. So stopping that you can't take your kids to some kind of sporting activity that they want to do. You can't take your parents to medical appointments or social or sporting events. Yeah, so those kind of things that you should be able to do. So when does pain become harm? And again, I could have, added quite a lot to this. If restrictions are too severe or are in place for too long. So here I've used the Belgium 24-hour house arrest for pre-trial cases, which Pedro's used to me banging on about. I'll now add the Brazilian 24-hour house arrest too. When wearers' circumstances change and electronic monitoring cannot respond quickly, efficiently and appropriately, and we've heard that in the US, we've heard from James in the US that this is a problem. Now, we don't really have the same problems in the UK, so basically everybody is told that if there is an emergency, like they need medical attention, then they just go, okay? Whether that's their kids or them. If there's a medical emergency, you leave, and retrospectively, they get the evidence to say you went to the hospital, etc., and it's all sorted out, okay? So there are ways and means around things that have been highlighted here. Equipment malfunctions, we all know that this equipment's a bit dodgy, right? I could talk at length about dodgy equipment. So we'll just leave it as malfunctions. What I call compliance anxiety and stress. And this actually tends to be higher with those people who want to comply, right? They worry about the equipment not working, about making sure that they comply, etc. So that compliance anxiety and stress is very real. When restrictions don't take into account the legitimate responsibility of wearers, employment, caring responsibilities and life, family life, we've heard a lot about that here. But I wanted to just spend, this was already here, but there are very blurred boundaries between pain and harm in some cases. Here we need to think, right, so there's a very eminent academic called John Braithwaite who's talked a lot about shame. So a justification for punishment, one of the reasons why we punish, so said, is that people need to be shamed. And that has a very good function within the criminal justice system. Now, I don't necessarily agree with it, but that is the point, okay? Now, stigma is a different thing, right? So shame may be legitimate, and stigma isn't, because that prevents those pro-social activities that we've just been talking about, may impact negatively on mental health. So that kind of shows why that distinction between pain and harm is very important, but also that it shifts. As usual, I can't move it on. Okay. Okay. Can you? Right, okay. So, of course, those things differ for different people. And this is why diversity matters and goes back to what I originally was talking about. Where those boundaries between pain and harm lies shifts depending on who we're talking about. And here we have an ethical choice between equality and equity. Hopefully I don't have to tell you the difference. The picture tells you, right? Basically, one is the standard approach, which most electronic monitoring does, right? Treat everybody the same and doesn't take into consideration their circumstances, whereas equity means that we treat different people differently so that they get the same outcome. And again, please. We have a number of ethical frameworks for promoting equality. But there's a problem with some of these ethical frameworks, not only that they only deal with equality, but they require interpretation. They're quite vague, right? I think they're important, but they're very high level, okay? So they're open to they have a lot of elasticity, as I would call it, right? Open to interpretation, a bit vague, and you can always have exceptions. So while they're very useful, they're not very useful if you're trying to persuade somebody that something needs to be done. What I think is important, and just to briefly say, because I know I'm going to run out of time and I haven't got halfway through, is because we're in the electronic monitoring data field, things are moving so quickly that trying to keep up with that is a real challenge, okay? You know, AI today is going to be very different in 6 months' time, and legal regulation and human rights frameworks, etc., cannot keep up with that. It's very difficult. But there are some professional principles that are useful, right? And this kind of comes from the doctors, from medicine, which is the do no harm, right? Going back to that pain-harm difference, that's an important point, you know, but there are real ethical questions about whether, when we're thinking about electronic monitoring, what we are trying to do. Are we trying to avoid harm? Are we trying to minimize harm? Or are we trying to repair harms from a different place that have happened before or for another reason? And that we need to consider. But to do no harm requires that the circumstances of the wearers are taken into consideration. But we also have to, and I hate the word balance and I don't like it, but I'll use the word balance because it's easy. We also have to think that no harm should come to the victims or the public as a result of electronic monitoring as well. It's not just the wearers we need to think about. Okay. I do not need to go through, can we go back one? Yeah, that one. I'm not going to go through these, only to say that these international conventions only promote equality, right? They do not promote equity. Next one, please. These ones, the Bangkok rules, promote equity. They are the ones that relate to gender. Okay, so when you're looking at what you need to look at the ones that are about equity, not just about equality. Also in the UK, we have what's called the public sector equality duty, which is also equity rather than despite the fact it's called equality, it's equity based. But what we need to spend some time thinking about what compliance with these standards actually means, and the monitoring and enforcement is key to effective implementation. Can we go on, please? Hang on, I'll try. Yep, hang on. Go. I need to go back one. Back to, can we go back to? Okay, so the next one is doing EM well, providing a diverse and responsive service. Oh, hang on, I'll do it. Okay, so this is a huge slide with loads of stuff on it, but it's basically questions to ask yourself, everybody, not just in Brazil, about what an EM service that managed well would look like that responded to diversity. So one would be that we need to know the circumstances of the wearers before we use electronic monitoring so we can fit a regime around them that takes into account their circumstances. Think about those visits to homes. They are very intrusive. Yeah. So think about when they happen, how they happen, and who does it. I'm obviously outside of here, happy. Consider when the equipment is fitted and by whom. Consider the visibility of the equipment. What language does the wearer speak and understand? And I suspect that's an issue in Brazil. It is certainly an issue in the UK, and it's also an issue in Belgium. Sorry, Pedro, I keep picking up on the way that you're working. Also consider the cognitive ability. Okay, how much can this person understand, and any kind of learning difficulties or mental health conditions that they might have. Consider the clothing that is worn by the wearer. So if it's a cultural clothing, okay, then you need to consider that we don't all dress in Western fashion, for want of a better word, Western fashions. Have they disclosed any experiences of violence or trauma or current risk to? So we had a meeting on Monday, and there was discussion about the fact that when people are on electronic monitoring, it's easy for them to be found, right? People know where they are. And in the UK, when I did some research quite a long time ago, I came up with found that people were concerned about being curfew to their houses because their drug, people who they owed money to would know where they were at that time. And that was one of the reasons why they didn't answer the door. I think that there's a bigger problem in Brazil about that, but I'm not going to go into it now. Do they care for others? Who else might be present when they're visiting wearers' homes? So in Norway, they've got amazing booklets that they can give to the wearers' children that tell them about what's going on with their mum or dad. How much agency do the wearers have? So think about children, right? If you use it on children, their parents are the people who drive them through exclusion zones, for example, okay, without thinking about it. You need to think about kind of how that happens, what their work and education, what are their daily tasks, religious, cultural activities. What system do you have in place for dealing with changing circumstances? I think in Brazil that is a problem. And what information needs to be provided to families and cohabitees? And then importantly, the 24/7 support. Electronic monitoring, the problems with electronic monitoring, the equipment malfunctions and all of that happen at night, right? So even if you had a probation service, it wouldn't be that helpful, right? You need a system of a monitoring centre or some system where they can get hold of people at the time that the issues are happening very well. Okay, so what are the general principles for a well-managed service? And I've put this together actually for the Ministry of Justice, but it's a useful kind of thinking through some of these things. So make sure it's proportionate and necessary, it's only appropriate, minimum amount of restriction, that it's responsive and flexible, there's a regular review. I haven't talked about exit strategies, when you actually reduce the amount of monitoring over time as a result of compliance. Yeah? Why do you need to, particularly if I understand it, you're monitoring for 4 years, seems to me a very long time, then to think about exit strategies. If people are complying, reduce the amount of monitoring over time. Informed and transparent, that is for wearers, the people they're cohabiting with, their significant others. They need to know what's going on because part of the issue is about anxiety from them as well. So you need to give them information and then also to publish information and statistics. Support, I've said that, very important, and to make sure there's some kind of availability of what we would call wraparound support. So that's kind of pro-social support. Appropriate regulation for collection and storage of the use of the electronic monitoring data. Appropriate staffing. Okay. Men turning up in black uniforms at night at somebody's home, I don't know whether this is you, but I know that it happens in other places, may not be the best thing, particularly if you're a traumatised woman who's been in a violent relationship for like 10 or 15 years, yeah? Not necessarily a good idea. And then to think through those equity and equality things. Can you put, I can't get this to work. There. Okay, so concluding. We need to improve generally, not with us, we're kind of the experts, the awareness of that, the intrusiveness of that technology and the impacts on everyday lives. So we need those stories about that, okay? So that people recognise the impact on those people who are wearing this. Consider how to use electronic monitoring well and make it responsive to all the different wearers and their circumstances. But, and it's an important but, we need to think about certainty so people know what's happening to them, and the public and the decision makers know what's happening. Simplicity, that we don't make it all so complicated that they don't know how to comply. And consistent in the sense of that people know what's happening and they know the result. If they comply, they know what's going to happen to them. If they don't comply, they know what's going to happen to them. This will make sure that it's legal and it's also ethical, but hopefully it will have benefits in terms of improved compliance and confidence in electronic monitoring and the legitimacy of it, because what the other kind of take home from this is that electronic monitoring doesn't have much legitimacy, certainly with the people in this room here, but it does have a role. And my stance is that electronic monitoring is not going away. I think we can kind of safely say it may be superseded by something else that's coming along, but it's not going away. And in terms of procedural justice, if wearers perceive that they are well treated, then they're more likely to comply, both in the short and long term. And that's actually what we want. We want people to get through their period of electronic monitoring safely, and then hopefully it has lasting impacts. And we know that it works if it's well done in the short term, because most people comply. Certainly from the Western literature, that is the case. Most people comply with electronic monitoring. So if we can make it work at the minimum use, then that would be better. And it might have some long-term effects, but it might not. That is still, there's a few studies coming out suggesting that it does have a long-term impact on offending, but we don't know. Yet it's too early to say. Okay, so I shall finish there. I think I might have gone over a bit, and apologies. Chair, sorry.
Professor, I believe that these are valuable information, and I noticed that there is a complexity on the electronic monitoring equipment in which we can have to propose offer a proportionality in the use, to look at the real consequences, the different alternatives, the means, and the ways of control, if it is 24 hours control, the restrictions, and these are all nuances that should be taken into consideration, especially in the uh, technological accompaniment. There is a problem of the technological evolution. We don't have the ability to accompany everything on the progress. The consequences of the user on day-to-day basis. There are simple things. For example, clothes problems. When we think of the anklet, we do not think that this can um, create problems for the person to get a job, for example. And these are details that we should take into consideration. We have to think of the benefit and cost of having a pattern and standardized uh, control system, or if we should have a customized control system. The evolution of the, we should also think of how the evolution of this monitoring should is going, because in the world it is taken as a measure, a preventive predictive measure, and now is advancing. Some circumstances that before were existing before, and now they are not existing anymore. You need to be aware of this to adequate this type of control to a new reality that's appearing. The question of legitimacy. Some people think that this electronic surveillance isn't anything, because you think that, oh, the person is not being punished, is not being controlled, and it isn't any kind of onus to these people. And we see that there are many difficulties for these people, that the electronic monitoring is difficult and is a restriction for these people. So the information will bring us to think of this system improvement, and I don't think that, and I think our professor by her manifestation. I'll pass the floor to Dr. Mayev, right? Marisi. She's graduated in psychology. She was the coordinator of the program Fazendo Justiça em Bahia from 2019 until 2022, and in Santa Catarina 2021. This program was a partnership between CNJ and the UN program, and with the support with the public ministry. And she is exercising the position of directors of the penal secretariat. And you have the floor for 20 minutes. Good morning, everyone. It is a great joy to be part of this space, a joy and also a challenge throughout everything that was already mentioned in these past 3 days, these three important days. I would like to greet by means of our Minister Sebastian Jr., all the components of this board that I'm sharing the pleasure and the important responsibility of closing this international conference. I take advantage of this possibility to greet everyone that accompanied us throughout these three conference days, people who were here presentially, those who were online, and I ask for permission to greet professionally those who to greet the professionals that are making the electronic maintenance monitoring throughout all the country, and I do that by thanking the Tocantins and Maranhão team that are here. So I greet that and extend these greetings to all the other states that at distance they invested time and organized themselves to accompany all the discussions that were very provocative. I under I suppose it was not easy to hear everything, but I think it was very interesting to hear all this information exchange so we can advance with the electronic monitoring in the country. I was very provoked by the speeches in these past days, and especially the provocation was very humorous by the Councillor Otávio Porti in the end of yesterday, in which he provoked us to think the electronic monitoring in an ideal scenario in which the electronic monitoring could consolidate as a policy with all the premises, principles perfectly attended. And what I propose today is that from what was proposed as a topic for discussion, which is ethics and future perspectives, I propose to build all my narrative around the reality of what it is possible to do today, and that the federal ent has already been organizing to structure, contribute, and to guide the actions of these states towards the policies in the national level. When we think of the future perspectives, and in this parallel, this counterpoint with the reality, nothing better than subscribing this future perspective on a temporal reality. So this excerpt that I do today is considering the 2024 to 2023, the next 3 years, and we consider here what has already been built, not only for the electronic monitoring, but also for the alternative policies of the jailing, understanding that there is not a unique solution, a unique strategy that can deal in an efficient way all the challenges that were already pointed out throughout all these days. And it's important to see what we are living right now. We are in a moment of fixing things, adjusting, to switch the mindset. So all this content is in a work in progress. These are not information that are already done, but it's matured in a matured level that we can already share something of today. The National Secretariat, the penalty policies national secretariat uh, is in a program of the public safety of citizenship, and in this perspective the national secretariat is positioning as an institution and builds as a goal of the actions and of the several actions articulated in the next years the commitment of reducing the imprisoned population by the structuring of the policies of disimprisoning in which that they can make people free in with policies that can make them more fair, and this is directly connected to the reducing of imprisoned people with the front of they are having in front the alternatives of the prison and the integration of these people to society. There are several actions, several policies structured so that this work can be oriented towards this goal. I mention one here, which is the facing policy of over imprisonment, and we have seven other policies that can mention some policies of citizenship needs, health, assistance, work actions, audit needs, and execution of what is being executed in the national prison system in the liberty topic. So this policy is articulated with other seven policies and also with the attention policy for people that are out of the prison. And I took some considerations to guideline to us these policies for the imprisonment with a highlight for some actions that will be priority. And the first of them is the attention service. The service was structured and articulated with a protagonism and involvement from the CNJ. Many of these actions in partnership with the Ministry of Justice and Public Safety, and in the next years it will have an organization and investment to advance in the institutionalization of the service, in the composition of teams, guaranteeing a treatment, a qualified attention of the person surveilled, be in the moment previous of the custody audience and after that. In these perspectives, I see the qualification of this decision and the interlocution and with different networks, social networks, which demands the intimate interlocution with other policies, public policies. So this service, the outline here maybe is not the format, is not the most assertive one because they are in boxes, but the logic is much more dialogical. The integration and articulation of these policies, because when we think of this framework of actions, the second point is the national policy of penalty policy, and there are some highlights that have actions towards the electronic monitoring in the area of the monitoring area, and there is an action that's not very well founded in the penalty policies. And in several moments of these days, it was signed the exceptionality of the electronic monitoring that should be subsidiary and it should not be towards all the people. It is a policy that should be related with the national policy of penalty policies. So we can have a different role of alternatives of penal responsibilization so that the surveillance can be done as a subsidiary measure, as a previous measure of the subsidiarity. And the second point that I call the attention is the restoration, justice, and the possibility of uh, fomentation of justice in the area of the executive power, and with some excerpts, criminal excerpts, making that we can expand this capillarity of these actions involving a protagonism of these people in these conflicts, establishing parameters, different parameters, new parameters of construction of a peace society. And the third point is the point that we have already talked about in the national policies of electronic monitoring, which has advanced a lot, in special from the accumulation of documentation and the norms structured from the last years, with some excerpts from the resolution 412, which has some resolutions that are relevant when we analyze the importance of this composition of the multidisciplinary teams that highlights the relevance of this work and science and shows the privacy of this monitored person, the use of this data. We are not a policy of investigation, we are a policy of responsabilization, penal responsabilization, and in this excerpt in which this acting is fit, there is an ethical commitment around the data that is shared, and this also brings some importance in the terms that of the measure of the electronic monitoring, and this term, the term of the measure and also the revision term, it brings some dynamics of operationality to the essentials that is very important. But in practice, there is much to advance. We have people arriving every day on the monitoring centrals, headquarters, with vulnerability levels very high, people in vulnerability situation, complex cases of mental health. So we need to advance in execution of these policies. And at last, the central of the vacancies regulation that's been receptionized by the possibility of qualifying the imprisonment alternatives and the empowerment of the acting, the reintegration, social reintegration, understanding that these are mechanisms that are very important for the operational results of these headquarters. So in this framework, this mirroring is very important so that it can be referentiated for the other states. When the state builds a planning to advance in the quantitative of the equipments, of the shackles, it's important to think if it is necessary to expand the quantitative of the equipment, or what it would be more assertive to adjust the flows according to the terms, the reviewing flows, the interaction with the judiciary, the justice on a whole, which I highlight the role that is very important from them. On this way, advancing on this perspective of this reality, what we can do on the public policy of electric monitoring, because we don't do any policy without any budget and without any planning that could make it possible to happen. In this idea, the program of the public safety of with citizenship has two actions that are very important and that are used as the forms of the federal end to empower these policies developed by the states. So there is an autonomy by the states in contributing the execution of their work, but there is also a commitment in a special way from this new way of the acting from the CNJ so that they can empower the policies in which they gain this competence and responsibility to plan these actions. So they can structure this planning. And here I highlight the transferring for the federal ends, the actions of the penal policies department. They are from the imprisonment fund, and as a legal process, there is a rate of this value that is passed to the states. They have the ability of using this resource, but we advance also in including this transferring, in this obligatory transferring, a plan or some budgetary plans so that we contribute in the movement of enlightening the priorities in national level. So the first thing I would like to highlight is the modernization, to give equipment to the system, what is being executed in the electronic monitoring in the states has a link with this perspective of modernization, the transfer of reformation, improvement of the penal processes. This is an innovation. All the resources of constructions and reformations, maintenance, they were before directed to the penal system department. And from that moment, this proposal, we can widen this, contemplating the penal services on overall. And in this idea, we gain more ability of contributing for the structuring of physical spaces that are adequate to receive people, to welcome people that are monitored. So I'm being a little, my time is short. So just to highlight also the actions of the attention to person that has aggressed and facing the imprisonment that also is framed in the alternative and pen alternatives other than the electronic monitoring. The second budgetary action involves other types of transfer that can be done by conveniums, corporations, that also will contemplate both policies. It was mentioned about the multidisciplinary teams. I would like to reinforce that there is not a framework that can establish priorities according to the categories of professionals, but the acting should be done in an articulated way. But I highlight that this policy should be thought in a perspective of accompanying people, not only specifically on accompanying exclusively of the decision. So when we compose teams and we have to compose in a proportional way, because many headquarters that nowadays they have these teams, because not many states do not have these teams. These teams, they didn't grow in a proportional way compared with the number of people that are being monitored. So we are trying to structure a national diagnosis to provide devices for them, to also create convenient cycles, arrangement cycles, to provide them investments, funds in their capacitation. We are structuring online courses, seminars, technical meetings for their qualification, and guidelines, documents, guidelines to highlight the need of having this framework well articulated. Here we go quicker. Here I mentioned the repass tools. These are the numbers of the electronic monitoring in the country. And other than repass tools, we have a concern about how this resource is being executed, and there is this execution lapsus uh, between the fund and the execution, and there is a fund that's trying to widen this movement of execution. And at last, I would like to conclude that we need to highlight the importance of institutionality, because it's very important. The system is of public safety is very important, and other than that, the need of uh, connecting with other public policies is also important. The protective measures are also important. We need to advance in the accompaniment of these men, answering for the urgent protective measures. We need to advance in the articulation with the women too for their protection network. We need to widen the interiorization of the headquarters, reviewing their measures, and advancing the sustainability and institutionality of the policies in the creation of networks and data systematization and information, so that we can create a framework of lecture and reading in a deeper, that we can read more in a deeper way, so we can enable a design and diagnosis for the structuring of this national policy of electronic maintenance monitoring. So I provide the contact of the directorate, and I thank in a special way all the professionals that are composing the citizenship directorate, that are in this process of building this framework, not only the qualification of the electronic uh, monitoring, but also the possibilities that are creating for the reintegration of these people. Thank you very much. We hear Dr. Ismail Levy, and she mentioned one very important point, which is the reduction of the imprisoned population. It's a very unhappy idea that we need to finish with the criminality, putting people in jail. So first of all, we have not death penalty. So these people, they can be 5, 10, many years in prison, and then also they will come back to society. And the prison should, instead of sometimes helping the person to be on the good way, it will incentivize to go to the opposite. So one person that sometimes had a failure, when he goes out of prison, he will not have the option of what to do here outside here. So the probability to go back to crime is very high. So we saw the concerns most time, or it's clear that it is not a simple process. We've seen the structural problem, and regarding the multidisciplinary team to accompany the technical support, the personnel, the ability of people to work with this type of work, the capacitation of these teams to work with the monitoring, and connecting with what Professor Dea mentioned before, because we need people to be prepared to accompany all these nuances that are involved in the electronic monitoring. We've also seen that Dr. Mariesi, she mentioned the different policies, the restoration justice process that could be also a good measure to reduce the imprisoned population. It's a long process, and unfortunately, there is a problem that is the same population. Nowadays, the Brazilian people, in the overall, parts from the principle that any suggestion of like impressional population reduction is bad. So the idea in the population mind is that we are accompanying the discussion right now about the guarantee rights, and sometimes many people from the area they are saying some uh, unbelievable things. Just making a parenthesis here, I think that the guarantee justice is the problem. I think the name of the problem. But when we talk about instruction, justice, it would be better. So I think the name that we have now is not good because it's expressing maybe something that can benefit the thieves. So I will pass the floor to Dr. James Miranda. He's graduated in law by the University of Brasilia in '96, and he was already on the Air Force, Brazilian Air Force and in '99 he started working in the military's public service as a general director of the military public service, and he was a procurator from 2016 2020, and 2000 until 2021 he was the national advisor for the public ministry, and 2023 2024 he was specialized for the armed conflicts, and now he's advisor for the public ministry for the external control of the uh, public safety. He has the floor for 20 minutes.
Me preparei para
I prepared myself to say good morning, but I'll say good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Time ran fast, which means that the seminar is being great. I would like to thank for this opportunity that was given to the Public Prosecutor's Office of joining such a great event. I would like also to greet our President of this panel, Minister Sebastião Reis Jr., and say it's an honor to have you as the President of this panel. Also, I would like to greet Dr. Antea from the United Kingdom and also greet our Secretary of Senapem, Maes, the psychologist who was with us this morning. I would also like to thank the President of the National Council of Justice and the Supreme Court of Brazil, Dr. Rosa Weber, for the invitation to join this event here in Brasilia on ethic and the future perspective of electronic monitoring. And also greet Minister Luiz Lanfredi. I'm sure that there is a lot of his hand in the organization as well as in the assemblage. When we see the event happening, we don't know the hard work that was endeavored months before. I'm sure that this happened. I'd also like to thank the participation of Dr. André Martins, who is a prosecutor office in the state of the Amazon that helped in the putting together of my presentation. We are here together to talk about the challenges of electronic monitoring in the Brazilian context in an attempt to harvest the good practices and the international problems and to show the undoubtful importance of the event. Currently, I am the president of the National Committee of Criminal Activities and Public Security, a permanent organ of CNDP that plays an important role in the perspective of public prosecutor because it disseminates and induces successful practices that are able to contribute with the improvement of the criminal justice system. In this context, I couldn't fail to notice and understand the relevance of electronic monitoring as yet another political criminal instrument directed to the prevention and repression of contemporary crime. Recently, Senapen published the 13th cycle of general information about the Brazilian prisonal system with a time cut that was made of December 2022, very recent, less than 6 months ago. The numbers call our attention because we have 6,448, 692 people who are arrested in physical cells, distributed in all kinds of penalty, and 183,603 people arrested in house arrest, out of which 91,362 are under electronic monitoring. By themselves, this is an Herculean task. The numbers show concern, especially of the organs that create and execute criminal policies such as the CNJ, the National Council of the Prosecutor's Office, National Secretary of Public Penal Policies, the National Council of Penitentiary and Criminal Policies, among other bodies. Electronic monitoring is foreseen in the Penal Code as a precautionary measure different from prison, as stated in Article 319. Also is regulated by Decree number 7627, seen as telematic surveillance, positional telematic surveillance by distance to people who are under precautionary measures, executed by technical equipment that allow for indicating its location. Then CNJ published resolution number 412, as well at the same token CNPCP published resolution number 31 of the December 1st, 2022 that regulates the implementation, follow-up, and inspection. These are normative essential acts that clear many topics, but that certainly do not solve all the issues and complexities facing the technological, administrative, legal, ethical, and budgetary challenges visualized by the executioners of this penal alternative. Therefore, there are many challenges that I want to point to, and I will bring just a few just to enrich the debate. That as a defender of the society as well as the rights of the victims, I have the role of inspecting the fulfillment of the penalty, but also protect the rights of the prisoners. In other words, this is a balance that needs to be always balanced. This is a scale that needs to be balanced, because besides the principle of excess, we have the principle of prohibition of protection, and victims cannot be on the verge of authorities, subject to authorities. We need to remind that public security also is a constitutional right. The debate regarding electronic monitoring is significant because it represents complex intersection of technology, security, and ethics. In addition to being understood as a useful measure to the reduction of super incarceration and allow for the possibility of social insertion of the prisoners, we have technological and inspection challenges that demand analytical balance among the many other concerns. For example, from the technological standpoint, we need to reaffirm the necessity of having robust systems that are trustworthy. Shackles need to be resistant to manipulation. They should last long in terms of battery life, and be able to send trustworthy and precise data. Furthermore, we need to have structure of network that is safe and modern to share the data, in addition to storage capacity to ensure the analysis and protection of the collected information. As we know, in this field, technology that is available in Brazil is very limited. Under the GPS, an instrument of location that sometimes becomes innocuous in many regions of the country. such as in the Amazon region. It is no news that due to the territory extension as well as the geographical challenges, we still have many problems regarding coverage, which could render difficult or even make it impossible the effective monitoring. Other challenges are imposed, and the issue of privacy of the monitored is one of them. Technology should be projected and used in a way that respects the rights of people who are monitored. But the debate must not be bound to a hyperbolic monocular vision in the line of the expression coined by Professor Douglas Fisher. It is known that the monitored person loses part of their privacy. After all, they are under the tutelage of the state that happened due to a crime that was committed. In most of the cases, data venia, positioning in opposite sense, does not ensure the unlimited privacy of the citizen that is monitored. It would be actually contralegend, given the limitations that occur under the legal restrictive situation in which this person is under. But it is clear that the concern remains in ensuring that the monitoring centrals are based on legal frameworks and that the public agents do not take advantage of the collected data to the commitment of crimes, because the safety of the data that is collected is extremely important, which means a significant risk of invasion and leakage in case no protection of measures are implemented. We have information, for example, of the leaking of this data and their availability to criminal factions, rival criminal factions that use the data to kill those who are monitored with the addresses. The one that should be under the tutelage of the state has their physical integrity completely exposed. Naturally, there are exceptions that need to be rigorously fought against, but that should not become the examples that serve as a rule to put in doubt all of the great work of the security agents that in their majority follow the law rigorously. As for the main concerns of the public prosecutor's office, we believe that even though public electronic monitoring could be adopted as a harmful measure, less harmful than prison itself, it is essential to ensure that the guarantees of the due process be observed. Electronic monitoring cannot be granted in an automated fashion in case the person who is being under surveillance cannot adapt to the measures, or in case the circumstances are not effective, such as people who live in communities of difficult access without the internet and who are not even able to feed the equipment. In those cases, in addition to the iniquity of the measure, society once again will be unprotected. How can you explain to the victim that, in fact, no restrictive measure or punishment measure was applied to the author of a crime against them? These are reflections that must not be ignored. In order to avoid this sort of situation, when you analyze the concession of monitoring, we must observe whether or not there are indications that the measure will be effective. Therefore, it is important that in this initial moment we take into account certain factors that could compromise its use. Another issue to bear in mind in order to have an effective EM has to do with financing, because the implementation and maintenance of the system involves considerable costs. That includes not only the acquisition of the equipment, but also the training of the personnel, maintenance of the system, and support infrastructure. Advanced technologies demand significant cost, and the system must be able to follow the person who is monitored in a precise fashion. Therefore, it is fundamental to have a careful planning, as well as substantial investment in infrastructure, training, technology, and cybersecurity to overcome these challenges. That's the only way for us to have an effective compatibilization of interest. Other than that, I couldn't fail to highlight that the focus of the discussion is focused on the implementation process and the impacts that the use of shackles have in people's lives who are monitored during the time of fulfillment of the measure. Very little is dedicated to the effectual outcomes in the long run, such as the reincidence and the effective decrease of criminality. It is obvious that we don't know that in addition to control, monitoring should also rehabilitate the monitored. This should be the most important measure, which involves not only providing the anklets to the citizen, but also allowing to ensure that they have professional capacity, technical quality, or technical qualification through multidisciplinary follow-up that allows them to be reinserted socially. I am coming towards the end. From these reflections that I make, my only objective is to bring more arguments to the debate, hoping that it doesn't end itself in a criminal policy that is just utilitarian, that is not repressed, or that is not compromised by the phenomena of criminality. I close by highlighting that the National Commission or the national system, prisonal system, is open to new projects, partnerships, and good practices that are geared towards the improvement of criminal justice. We have a data bank in which we save all of the good activities that are performed in the criminal system to give base to other prosecutor officers and justice system as a whole to use these projects. I hope that the learnings that we have obtained along the seminar serve for us to have a justice system in the future at the level that the society so desires and hopes. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the manifestation of Dr. Jani, and I was able to capture his main ideas, which are regarding the challenges regarding the use of EM. First one is technology. We need adequate technology and a structure that is good enough so that the monitoring is effective. Second, the issue of the limit of privacy. In other words, the risk that we have that the data from this monitoring is leaked and used for other ends. This is a very delicate issue, and here we have a coupling with the technological issue. In other words, we need to have a safe system that ensures that the data will not fall in the wrong hands. The third topic is the effectiveness of the monitoring. You see that you can't impose monitoring in situations in which it cannot provide a response. In other words, it doesn't give the result that we expect. The cost, I believe that there is a need of investment, and this is something that has been said before. In other words, it's not a cheap system. Maybe it is cheaper than the penitentiary system, the traditional system as we know it. But we need to invest then in the construction of prisons. This is a way for us to have a financial return. And another concern that is very good for everyone is the issue of reinsertion of the person who is under arrest in society. In other words, it is useless to have a whole repression system without concerning about the reinsertion. These are very important, relevant concerns, and that I thank you very much for your participation. I'm going to ask the members of this panel if you would like to make any observation or any comment so that we can close. I will hand the floor to Dr. Athea in case you want to make any observation, or any final words? Your mic is off, ma'am.
I don't really want to be the person keeping you away from the sun and your lunch. So I just want to say thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a fascinating 3 days. I think on behalf of all my international colleagues, we'd just like to say thank you very much. It's been very interesting, and we look forward to hearing more about how your EM develops, hopefully in a more ethically and better way. So thank you very much.
Well, I think that I am going to follow what my colleague here in the panel signaled. I would also like to thank for the invitation once again, and thank for being able to share with everyone, with every one of you along these 3 days, issues that are extremely important and complex and provoking. I'd also like to thank the National Council of Justice for the partnership and the joint construction, as well as the proximity and articulation that has been a powerhouse to the development of a new design of justice in the country. I would also like to thank for the invitation. I'm sorry, the mic has failed. I would also like to thank for the invitation and thank for the great exchange, especially a special acknowledgement to the National Council of Justice that invested on the structure of this venue. So thank you very much, and I extend my acknowledgement to everyone, and I hope everybody has a wonderful lunch, including me. Thank you. Mr. Counselor? Sure. Well, I am going to second everything that has been said. As we know from school, before lunch, nobody has any doubts right before lunch. So I would like just to express my joy to be here, leave a warm hug to my dear friend Luis and Fred, and at the same time of a provocation. I didn't want to say before, but to me, there is a lack of participation of the prosecutor's office. During the 3 days, we've only had 20 minutes, Mr. Minister, so I believe that the prosecutor's office should be more present, because we bring a vision that is a little different. We have a very academic, very judicial-oriented vision, and I believe that the prosecutor's office is important for us to see and work together so that this mass grows. So I just want to express my acknowledgement and my gratefulness for being able to join this event. Thank you. Well, I am not going to be the one that is going to be the hindrance between you and your lunch. So I would just like to thank once again the CNJ for this opportunity. Thank everyone for your presence, especially the presence of those who are here with me at this panel. So thank you very much. I wish you all a wonderful lunch. We would like to thank the presentations, and we declare this international conference on electronic monitoring, ethics, and insurance of rights closed. We wish you all a wonderful afternoon.